Where did this firewall come from?
Safety mechanism. Cabal are encroaching on Rasputin. The Cabal have severed the lines to the security terminal and sending you physical copies of the Omni Key. Upload complete. Now we can talk to Rasputin and see what's in here.
Wait, we've got something approaching.
terminal. Upload the Omni key and we'll be able to open up that engram.
Whoa. It's...
Wait. Don't tell me. I want to see it firsthand. I programmed Rasputin's linguistic AI. I taught him his first words, and then he made his own. That is an answer. And that is a gift. Thank you. These blueprints you recovered are something special. My sister Elsie and I worked on these together. I don't want to work on things alone anymore, if it can be helped. So I was wondering if you'd maybe help me finish it. Let me know if you find any Golden Age tech out there. You have any updates?
All around the world. And I touched in that book on the role of psychedelics in the origins of Christianity, which of course is a dynamite subject. And what Brian has done in The Immortality Key has been to present hard and fast evidence that the first Christians were using psychedelics and that their religious experiences were mediated by psychedelic experiences.
And Brian, how did you get involved in this?
It's a long story.
You look like a stoner, by the way. I'll just tell you right now. You look like a guy who's done a few mushrooms in his day.
Oddly enough, I don't do drugs, and I've never done psychedelics.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
You want to start?
Today?
Well, I wish we were in L.A. I could hook you up. But in Texas, the laws are sketchier here. What led you to this then?
I was fascinated by Graham's work, which I only came across about 12 years ago. I was a Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit undergrad major. And instead of getting the PhD or becoming a priest, which the two options when you study Latin and Greek, I went to law school instead for no reason whatsoever, and then wound up at a law firm, and a couple years into it started reading about these psilocybin studies coming out of Hopkins and NYU, and that amazing statistic that 2/3 of the participants were describing it as one of the most amazing experiences of their lives. And it hit me that there was something there, because the testimony coming out of Hopkins and NYU in a very clinical setting immediately reminded me of what I heard about Eleusis. And for those who don't know what Eleusis is, it's essentially the spiritual capital of the ancient world. It was where the best and brightest of Athens and Rome went to essentially meet a goddess in the flesh and have this mind-blowing visionary experience. So before Jerusalem, before Rome, before Mecca, there was Eleusis, and for some reason we're not taught about this in our high school mythology or Western Civ classes. But it was there that Plato, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius all went to drink a magical potion and, in their words, have this vision, what Plato calls a blessed sight and vision, the holiest of mysteries, in which they claim to have a direct encounter with the goddess and completely eradicate their fear of death. It was very similar to what the volunteers are saying with their single experience of psilocybin.
Now, with Eleusis, how much history do we have? How much recorded history that documents these rituals, and is there any that describes the actual contents of this mixture?
No, there isn't much. I mean, I say Eleusis is like the Fight Club of the ancient world. The first rule about Eleusis is you don't talk about Eleusis. All we have is this fragmentary testimony, again, from Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, and others. They do talk about a vision that's almost universal, and they almost universally talk about this once-in-a-lifetime transformative event where they become initiates. And only they properly have life after death, because at the time, the Greeks didn't really look forward to the afterlife. In fact, there was no afterlife. You just disappear into Hades to do God knows what. But people walk away from Eleusis saying that they'd found salvation. And we don't know why or how. We know this potion is involved. We know they make this pilgrimage 13 miles from Athens to Eleusis to drink this potion. We know they prepare for months, if not years, before it. And they're forever changed afterwards, but we have very little hard data to actually look into it. And so in 1978, this trio of renegades, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD, and Carl Ruck, who was then the chair of the classics department at Boston University, they put out this book, The Road to Eleusis, claiming they'd found the secret after 2,000 years. And what they claimed is that this potion was actually spiked with ergot, which is that naturally occurring fungus from which you can synthesize LSD. And in fact, it's how he synthesized LSD by accident in 1938 with cultures of ergot.
We've talked about ergot before in this podcast, connecting it to the Salem witch trials, which is very speculative, but they think there's real evidence that shows that there was a late frost during the time of the Salem witch trials that probably led to mold growth on their wheat, which probably led to ergot infestation of their food. And so these poor people were, unintentionally eating acid.
Unintentionally.
Yeah.
It happened a lot.
Yeah.
There were ergot outbreaks across time, especially in the Middle Ages. They would call it St. Anthony's fire, the Ignis Sacer, because it's so common. In fact, if you talk to any brewer today, at least the brewers that I was talking to, I went to see this beer scientist in Munich, Germany, Martin Zarnkow, and he says you can't avoid it. Now, it's more common on things like rye, but it also pops up on barley and wheat too. And again, it's unavoidable and it's highly, highly toxic. The question is, does it really produce the kind of vision, the visionary experiences that people have on psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and others? According to Albert Hofmann, absolutely. So as a matter of fact, I went into the Harvard archives where Wasson's papers are kept to this day in the botany libraries. And I found a letter that Albert wrote Gordon, his co-author, in 1976, saying that Albert had self-experimented with ergonovine, which is one of these alkaloids in ergot, and he claimed in 1976 it was 5 to 10 times more potent than psilocybin.
Whoa. It's fascinating to me that these cultures seem to have hid some of these rituals. And this goes back to really as far back as we have recorded psychedelic use, like soma. We still to this day don't know what that is. And it's described in these incredible ways in ancient Hindu texts, but we don't know what it is.
We have an idea. I actually brought some Sanskrit to show you.
Really?
You want to see some Sanskrit?
Hell yeah. Can you put it up on the screen?
It's under the Soma tab.
Oh, look at how beautiful that is.
There it is.
Their language, writing it in Sanskrit, God, it's so pretty.
Do you want me to read it for you?
Please, you can read that?
Yeah. So this was my major in college. So in the very middle there, you can see Imam Mindra Gavashira Yavashira Channa Pisha Akatya Varshabhihi Sutama. And what he's saying there is this is from the Rig Veda. Right, and it's the oldest literature in Western civilization. We think it's among the Indo-European languages. It's the oldest recorded literature that we have. It could be 1500 BC, 1700, perhaps much earlier, like the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek. This is the mother tongue of all the Indo-European languages. And what they write about a lot is soma, which is both a god and the juice that is pressed from this god. And what they're talking about there is making this ritual potion, very much like the kukion that we find among the ancient Greeks. And here, soma is described as a mixed potion. Yavashira means mixed with barley. Gavashira, from Sanskrit go, gava is milk, mixed with milk. And so I've read all the theories that you have about what soma was, whether it was the Amanita muscaria mushroom or some psilocybin-containing species or DMT. The way they describe soma here is always a mixed potion, which, so in this case, mixed with barley and milk.
So that would be an ergot, some sort of
already they're mentioned. I mean,
Yeah.
and so that's what Rock Hoffman and Wasson were saying in 1978. We have literature from the 7th century BC. It's called the Hymn to Demeter, where they record these ingredients of what the kukion was. You asked, like, where's the actual evidence? So in the 70s, we didn't have much. It starts with the literature, which is what classicists do. And so there's this Hymn to Demeter that was discovered in 1777, a year after we declare our independence from Graham's people. And what they found in there in line, sorry, Graham. We're in Texas, man.
Absolutely. Well done. I'm all for independence. I'd like to be independent of my own country if possible as well.
Well, Texas is taking refugees at the moment, is it not?
Well, that's what's happening here. That's why we're here. We're refugees from the country of California,
Exactly.
this nation state of California. So why do we know why they combined it with milk? Was it just so that it was easier to consume?
That's what we don't know. We don't know why the kukion was this mixed thing either. But so in the Hymn to Demeter, they record these ingredients. It's alfi, which is barley, hudor, which is water, and blechon, which means mint. And that's all we had.
So it doesn't say milk? You didn't say milk?
That was in Soma,
And soma.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
which they mix with all kinds of things, and not just barley and milk, but also honey. As a matter of fact, Soma is often identified with madhu, which is honey in Sanskrit.
McKenna speculated that there was a transfer in culture of a psychedelic-based culture to an alcohol-based culture, based on climate change and also based on preserving things in honey, and that honey would create mead, and mead, which if people don't know, is an alcohol beverage that's actually made with honey. Do you think that this was the case with the use of honey as well, that is used as a preservative, or was it used to make it taste better or more palatable?
We don't know. We don't know. That's the problem when we're talking about ancient plants and fungi, plants especially. We don't know what plants they're talking about. So the ancient literature records all kinds of plants across the languages.
But if I could jump in, Joe, you're absolutely right. There was secrecy that surrounded the use of these potions in the ancient world. There's a case from Athens of the potion from Eleusis being used for recreational purposes, and this is roundly condemned by all concerned, that it should only be used for the sacred and spiritual purposes of which it was intended. So there was a great deal of secrecy that surrounded the use of these potions, and the potions were a doorway or a gateway into another level of reality. And what's fascinating from Eleusis and many other ancient accounts is the way that people come back having lost their fear of death, that they don't regard death as the end anymore. It's just another stage on the journey, just the beginning of the next great adventure. It's Brian is absolutely right to draw attention to the modern work with psilocybin. And again, we find people who are terminal cases, who are imminently facing death, losing their fear of death as a result of using psilocybin. So we can begin to see connections between what we understand about these extraordinary substances in the modern world and how the ancient world used them.
That does seem to be a universal theme. This theme of alleviating the fear of death, and this comes up constantly with people that I know personally that have had these psychedelic experiences. They say, "Well, I feel like I went to heaven," or "I feel like now I understand why people believe there's this perfect afterlife." That I've actually experienced it.
A lot of the critics will say that it's some kind of natural human tendency that we don't want to die, and that we're afraid of death, and that religions provide us with some sort of solace, some sort of feeling of security. But I don't think that washes at all. I think what's striking about the psychedelics is it's a direct experience that the person has. They have an experience. It's not a teaching. It's not something that they're told about. It's not a scripture that they read. It's an experience that they have, and that experience eliminates the fear of death. I think Brian, by the way, having written The Immortality Key, for which I've only provided the foreword, I think Brian is absolutely right to be a psychedelic virgin. In my case, because I have used psychedelics and many other substances, a lot of my critics just try to write off all my work, whether it's on lost civilizations or on psychedelics. They try to write it all off as the rantings of a sort of drug-fueled maniac. And I think it's very smart of Brian not to put himself in that situation. I hope he will work with psychedelics in the future, but I think he was right not to work with psychedelics before writing this book and to concentrate on the evidence.
Well, Michael Pollan, who later in life experienced psychedelics and wrote pretty brilliantly about them. For me, he's one of the more interesting people to discuss it, because Michael's an investigative journalist. He takes deep dives into these subjects, and his deep dive into psychedelics was incredibly illuminating. And so for him, I really enjoyed talking to him about it, and I really enjoyed his book as well. His perceptions of it were really unique, because you're talking about a guy who lived his whole life without them, and then really dove head first for his book.
And
It's kind of what happened to me when I wrote Supernatural. I had apart from one experience with LSD in 1974, I hadn't used any psychedelics until I began to research Supernatural back in the early 2000s. And because I'm a kind of boots on the ground researcher, I felt it was essential that I have these experiences. What I couldn't guess was the way that the experiences would utterly change and transform my life. And I can understand from a level of personal experience why psychedelics do lie at the root, I think, of all the world's religions. And those religions are now busily at work trying to deny that connection.
Well, they're not just trying to do it. There's many people in science that are trying to deny these connections too. And it's so unfortunate that the people that are trying to deny these connections or the significance of these experiences haven't had them. I don't think anybody who has a dimethyltryptamine experience can just dismiss it as being no big deal. It's too crazy. You need to do it, sir. This guy. I mean, just the fact that it's one of those things where everyone who does it comes out of it saying, "I can't believe that's real." I can't believe you can just get there that quickly. That 3 puffs and all of a sudden you're in Narnia. I can't, and we're not way more intense than Narnia. You're in
Narnia, and you're in a place where entities are actually communicating with you and speaking to you and teaching to you. I mean, this is another aspect of psychedelics, is the moral aspect of psychedelics. Critics and enemies of psychedelics want to associate them with some kind of immorality, but actually anybody who's worked extensively with psychedelics will know that they contain moral teachings. Whether it's the mushrooms or whether it's LSD, they cause us to examine our own behavior, our own impact upon others, to question our unkindness to others, and to give us at least the push to begin to be better people and more nurturing and more caring people for others. So this strong moral element in psychedelics, again, is totally ignored by the critics who just want to demonize these substances for reasons that I think are rather sinister, actually.
Well, I think our current culture lacks a map of the territory. And if we had some sort of legitimate psychedelic counseling where we could go somewhere and experts both in pharmacology and in medical science can talk people through these experiences and help them achieve them and get people to realize that, much like the ancients, these experiences it's not wise to use them recreationally. I mean, you can...
No.
You can if you want. I mean, many people have and then inadvertently benefited from them greatly. But I think they're very profound, and I think they should be treated almost like you've got a Willy Wonka golden ticket to go meet God, because that's what it seems like. It's what it seems like is happening.
It was for the ancients.
Should be treated with respect.
Yeah.
Should be treated with respect and with reverence, because of this sense that we're passing through a doorway into a seamlessly convincing parallel reality, and the possibility that isn't just a concoction of our brains, that the brains are simply acting as an interface or a transceiver between us and that other level of reality. And again, you can see the connection with psychedelics and religion here. My view is, and I've said this before on your show, Joe, if I were running the world, anybody who wanted to be a president, a prime minister, a head of state of any kind, I think it should be obligatory that they have at least a dozen sessions with a powerful psychedelic. It can be DMT, it can be ayahuasca, it can be LSD, but they got to go through those dozen sessions. They should be guided by experienced practitioners. And at the end of those dozen sessions, I very much doubt if those individuals would be the same individuals who went into the application for the job in the first place.
No, I don't think you could be the same. When you write about all this, how curious are you personally of the experience, and do you plan on having it?
I do, under the conditions that you set. I mean, I think that we're in a period now where everything is about to change. The clinical research is advancing. Rick Doblin is moving to phase 3. You have researchers at Hopkins, NYU, now UCLA, looking at psilocybin for a host of different conditions, from depression, anxiety, end-of-life distress, which is really fascinating. And I think that sometime over the next 5 years, the FDA is going to get involved, and these will become available at least for specified conditions. And what I look forward to is maybe in 10 years' time or less, these retreat centers, which are licensed and regulated with professional staff and medical supervised staff who essentially guide people through what would be a novel initiation experience, not unlike what may have happened 2,700 years ago.
I'm hoping they're going to be backdoored in as therapy for people with pre-existing conditions that we have right now, like opioid addiction, Iboga, like Ibogaine being introduced, and MDMA for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, for soldiers, because there's been so much real solid evidence that it's incredibly beneficial to these people, particularly the opioid crisis. I mean, we have a real problem in this country with people being addicted to these pills and then wind up dying from them. That can be nipped in the bud like really effectively with Ibogaine. And the fact that you have to leave the country to have these Ibogaine experiences is really, it's a terrible statement on the rational thinking of our culture today, because it's not like these are unknown things. We're talking about it right now on a podcast that millions of people are listening to, and we've talked about it dozens of times in the past. And it's something that scientists are aware of, researchers are aware of, and particularly people who have come back from there and have had these experiences and have been cured of their addictions. They literally rewires the way the brain interfaces with these opioids. And the fact that it's not available to people and they have to go through traditional counseling and just and benefit from their willpower and somehow or another try not to relapse. It's terrible.
We're even just mitigating some of that. I mean, even cannabis, for example, which can mitigate some of those addictive potentials.
Yes.
I worked with athletes, for example, which might interest you. So I represented a guy named Mike James, who was an NFL player, who we believe is the first professional athlete in the U.S. to seek a therapeutic use exemption from the NFL to get off his opioids and use cannabis instead. And we were there at 51st and Park Avenue at NFL headquarters, arbitrating with the NFL to try and get him a cannabis supply. And he lost. And he was fined 6 figures in the process, and he left the league because of it.
He's not the first one, right? Who's the other, Jamie, you're a football fan. Who's the other famous football player who couldn't kick the weed?
Ricky
Williams.
That's right, Ricky Williams.
He never sought a TUE, though. It was unthinkable to get a TUE at the time.
But it's amazing that the NFL would have a problem with marijuana when so many of those guys are on pills. I mean, some of those guys are so severely injured. I mean, it is one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal sport in the world. And the fact that these guys can't seek marijuana for relief when they allow them to take opioids, it's just bananas. It doesn't make any sense.
Because we live in an insane society, which has got all its priorities upside down and is completely screwing up this beautiful world that human beings have been gifted by the universe. And I think it boils down to relatively few people. We just have incredibly bad governments, lousy leaders, totally irresponsible, lacking any initiative or imagination, in it entirely for themselves. It's a messed up world, and it's a kind of litmus test for how messed up that world is, that sovereign adults cannot take the responsible decision to use psychedelics without risking jail. It's as simple as it's very, very insane that should be the case. And yet alcohol is glorified in our society. As you say, the opioids are prescribed hand over fist by big pharma. We're very mixed up. And I have a feeling that the sooner we get our politicians onto major psychedelics, the better things are going to be.
Well, I think we got to get the whole world involved as well. But we don't want to be the only ones that are tripping. That would be, that'd be a real problem if the Chinese and the Russians are not tripping and we are. We're like, everything's going to be fine, man.
Yeah, and also the other point to make, again, the critics try to trivialize this, but actually working with psychedelics it can be really hard work. It can be really grueling. It can be really demanding. It can put you through the psychological ringer as you confront your own dark side and learn how to deal with it.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a recreational role for these substances, and I honor the right of sovereign adults to use them for recreational purposes if they wish to do so. But it's the deep work that these psychedelics require us to do, which is really fascinating and which is not easy. It's very, very, very difficult. I personally find it difficult. I don't rush to my next psychedelic adventure. I prepare myself very, very carefully and with some experience. And those are experiences, whether they're real or not. Experiences that, in fact, you experience does.
Yeah, you were breaking up a little bit there, but yeah, I completely agree with you about that. I mean, I get terrified when I take an edible. A marijuana edible is the introspective nature of those things, the way it breaks down your thoughts and your behavior and finds the skeletons in your closet. But
You're in there for 6 hours.
Searching around with a flashlight. I tell people though, but that's one of the things that I like about it. I learn things. I know it's scary. I know I feel terrifying while it's happening. But when I come out of it on the other end, I genuinely feel like I'm a better person. Like it's at that moment, I will be nicer to you. I'm better. I'm better at being me. You know, it's very effective. It really works. There's something to it, and it's available. It's not something that you have to, you go to counseling for years and years, and it's right there. You can get it real quick.
This was the whole point of the mysteries, by the way, in the ancient world. I mean, so there was a whole apparatus dedicated to curating these experiences for people. And sometimes it was once in a lifetime, like at Eleusis, at some later point in your life. And then you have the Dionysian mysteries, which are a bit weirder and a bit crazier. But they were also curated by professionals, by technicians, women in this case, who were thought to be spiking wine with all kinds of magical plants, herbs, and fungi. But the mysteries existed to create this experience of death and rebirth. And they're supposed to be terrifying. You're supposed to enter the underworld to meet the goddess. It doesn't happen in the daylight. It doesn't happen prancing around. And the Greeks are known for lots of great things that we've inherited, like democracy and the arts and the sciences. And what we're doing right now, this dialogos, through these mikrophonos, these are all Greek things and Greek technologies that we've accepted as part and parcel of Western civilization. But there was another part to them. And it's a part, again, that is not taught in high school mythology or Western Civ. And there's this deeply mystical aspect in the mysteries, for example, which the Greeks really looked to as something that wasn't just like a special part of civilization, but the central part of it. So there's this, I'll tell you a story about this 4th century historian Zosimus. He records the testimony of a Roman guy named Praetextatus, who was initiated at Eleusis. Because remember, it wasn't just people from Greece. It was around the Greek Empire, including at that time were people who'd been influenced by the Greeks. And Eleusis has survived up until the 4th century AD, at which point it's destroyed. It's eliminated by the Christianized...
By Christians, yeah.
By the Christianized Roman Empire in the late 4th century. And so there were different attempts to wipe it off the map. And in 364, the Emperor Valentinian, he essentially outlaws all nocturnal celebrations because these things are always at night. Eleusis was at night, which speaks to part of the experience. And this guy, Praetextatus, is recorded as saying, Valentinian, please don't shut this down. I'm an initiate. I've been to Eleusis. I've drunk the potion. I've seen the goddess. Please do not eliminate this. Eleusis is the one thing that holds the entire human race together, he said. He said, if you get rid of Eleusis, life for us will become abiotos, which in Greek means unlivable. It wasn't just about Greek existence, it was about human existence. There was something happening at Eleusis with that potion, with this beatific vision that literally held civilization together like glue for the ancient Greeks. And democracy, the arts, the sciences, everything else was an offshoot of that experience. Eleusis was the foundation.
One of the things you talked about was that there was this transference, like the Eucharist eventually became a placebo. Do you think that what do you think it was initially? Do you think it was a psychedelic mushroom?
So that's Allegro certainly thought that, right?
Right.
John
Marco Allegro, author of the Sacred Mushroom and the Scroll.
So he releases that book in 1970, and he claims that Christianity is the guise for a Near Eastern fertility cult. And I think it's very interesting, but there aren't many linguists who support the proposition.
Right. There's a lot of people that disagree with them pretty heavily, right?
I mean, from like a purely linguistic perspective, it's to explain it briefly. So he says that.
Did you read this? The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Yeah.
Did you read it?
Several times.
Did you read the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth as well?
From Allegro.
Yeah, that's the one that was. So the Catholic Church bought out the original one, right? And it was very difficult to get a hold of for the longest time. You had to buy copies of it.
I've heard rumors to that effect. Yes.
Yeah, and then he comes out with the second book, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth. What did you, knowing as much as you know about language, like what did you feel like he made leaps? Did you feel like he made these connections that maybe were based on speculation?
So he writes, it's pure philology, right? So it's word games and things that only linguists, I think it's incredible that people who aren't linguists can actually read that. It's really, really difficult to read Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. But the basic premise is that the New Testament, written in Greek, has this Semitic substratum. So underneath the Greek, the gospel writers and Paul are actually referring to different terms in Hebrew or Aramaic, and that these terms have in turn come from the Sumerian, which any linguist would say is a language isolate, that there is no real relationship between Sumerian and the Indo-European languages like Greek and the Semitic. So the premise of the argument is something that most linguists don't accept. However, and Carl Ruck has written the afterword to one of the editions you probably have of Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And he gets into some complex theories about psycholinguistics and this interesting idea that just because they aren't related, there are certain words, certain names, certain vocabulary, like plant definitions, which would carry across the different languages. And I find that somewhat interesting, but when you dig into the words that Allegro was recreating, he places an asterisk actually next to these words because they can't be corroborated by the ancient text. So some of these Sumerian words he straight up hypothesizes as existing, but they can't really be found in the existing tablets. So it's hard to correlate some of those meanings he draws down from the Sumerian. But that said, he makes very interesting claims. For example, like in 1 Corinthians 22, there's this interesting line where he says about that we preach Christ crucified is a scandalon for the Jews and a folly for the Greeks. And scandalon in Greek means like a bolt or a snare, like a trap. And Allegro ties it to like a tikla in Aramaic, which is like what he calls the bolt mushroom, and in Sumerian ukushtigila. And so he's saying that Paul's actually telling the Jews that the Christ crucified is a mushroom instead of a scandalon. It's like a code word. Like the scandalon is a mushroom, and then for the Greeks he says it's a folly, which is moira in Greek, which actually means mandrake, which is another psychedelic plant. So there's all this different wordplay going on, but it's really hard to tease out any physical forensic evidence for this stuff, which was what I went after.
Was Allegro's position, if I recall correctly, that the sacred mushroom was Amanita muscaria?
Yeah, that was even the cover of his book. Was a photo of Amanita muscaria.
And that's where I have I think Allegro did amazing work, but that's one area where I have a problem with Amanita muscaria as the psychedelic of choice in early Christianity, because in shamanic cultures where Amanita muscaria is used, it's recognized that the mushroom is much more effective after it's been passed through a human body, or indeed through the body of a reindeer, and emerged in urine. And so those shamanistic cultures of Siberia use Amanita muscaria by drinking it in the urine of a shaman who has previously consumed the mushroom. And I don't see a lot of evidence for that in early Christianity, and it's why I like the work that Brian has done, looking at the really hard evidence for psychedelics in early Christianity, which are not in this case Amanita muscaria, if I'm correct, Brian.
Isn't the speculation about Amanita muscaria that it's seasonable? It's seasonal. It's also genetically variable. Like there's different species of, like, much like different fruits taste differently. There's different versions of the Amanita muscaria that have more psychedelic compounds in them, and that there's all sorts of ways of preparing them that we've completely lost. Am I getting this wrong? I've only had one Amanita muscaria experience, and it wasn't very convincing.
Yeah, and this is often the case, but I'm told, I've not had the experience myself, but I'm told that if you can bear the idea of drinking the shaman's urine after he or she has consumed the Amanita muscaria, you will have a really powerful journey.
Yeah, but you don't want a shaman just laughing hysterically after you drink his urine.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, the joke's on you, stupid. Yeah. There's also so many correlations between the Amanita muscaria and Santa Claus to shamans.
The colors, the red and white,
yeah. There's also the bag, the toys, the fact that they would dry them on these coniferous trees, the fact that these mushrooms have this mycorrhizal relationship with coniferous trees, where they tend to grow under pine trees, which is the tree that we use for Christmas trees. But the fact that they're bright red, like a toy that is in a package waiting for a child to open it up. There's so many of these weird connections. The colors, the fact that reindeer are with Santa Claus, the fact these reindeer fly
through the heavens.
Yeah, I mean, and that caribou are notoriously attracted to Amanita muscaria mushrooms. In fact, people that have had psychedelic rituals and gone outside to urinate have talked about caribou knocking them over to try to get to their urine. And caribou are reindeer. They have been observed eating these things. So they have this weird relationship. All those things are together, connected in some sort of a strange way. And there's also a history of shamanic rituals being outlawed in Siberia, and the way they got around it was they would come through the chimney, which is just crazy. They would climb onto people's roofs and slide down the chimney to deliver the mushrooms.
It's just another example of the way that our culture takes an ancient historical truth and completely castrates it and turns it into Santa Claus. Whereas what we're actually dealing with are profound experiences in deeply altered states of consciousness.
Well, it's also, this information seems to have been lost fairly recently, because if you go back to the early 1950s and 40s and look at Christmas cards, the Christmas cards and depictions of Christmas almost always contained elves and Amanita muscaria mushrooms. The Amanita muscaria mushroom was synonymous with Christmas for some strange reason. Have you ever seen those old? Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
It's all over the fairy tale books too. You can't avoid the Amanita.
Yeah.
Everywhere you look, which is why I think Allegro was also interested, writing in 1970 and studying it in the 50s and 60s. I think that's why he glommed onto the Amanita.
But it's such an unconvincing mushroom. Like the people that I know that have experienced it in terms of a psychedelic ritual, it's just, I don't know anybody who's really blown their brains out with it.
No, and Gordon Wasson also thought it was the ingredient behind Soma as well. He writes a book about this in 1968, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. That was his guess too for Soma.
But Wasson was experienced with psilocybin, which is so universally regarded as being effective. That's why it's so confusing.
I always found that strange too, to be honest. So Wasson, I mean, to explain where this comes from, Wasson has this incredible experience with Maria Sabina in 1955 in Oaxaca, Mexico, when he consumes we think psilocybe mexicana, and he is catapulted to the heavens, and he has this vision that he describes as the realest thing he's ever experienced under the influence of the psilocybin. And the thought occurs to him, he writes later in 1957 in Life magazine. He says that could it be the case that the divine mushrooms are in fact the answer behind the ancient mysteries? Which is why he then went and started looking at the Amanita, perhaps, or eventually ergot, which is where I pick up the scent. At some point in his correspondence with Albert Hoffman, they together began focusing on ergot, like we said, because it's so common and so natural, but so highly toxic too. And Albert claimed to have this experience with it, and so for years and years, after teaming up with Carl Ruck, they were convinced that ergot had to somehow be involved.
So what is the speculation of what the Eucharist originally was?
According to the early Gnostics?
Yeah, I mean, what is there any text that explains what the initial food was?
Well, I mean, we have the canonical explanation from the Gospels. We have Saint Paul's letter. I mean, the honest answer, and I think any priest would say this too, is the honest answer is we don't know. The Gospels are written anytime between 65 and 100 AD. Paul's letters are some of the earliest writings that we have, like the letter to the Corinthians, for example. He writes that in about 53 AD. And the way he describes what's happening there is very, very interesting. Maybe we can pull it up actually. I brought some of the Greek from the New Corinthians. It's under Christian Pharmacon, and the 4 Corinthians 11:30. So at some point, I was looking for what that original Eucharist was, and where it was taken. So you have to think about the Greek world at this time. Jesus is born in the Holy Land, but Christianity really takes root in the Greek-speaking parts of the empire, which is why Paul's letters are written to Greek-speaking people, right? And why it's interesting to follow this theory, because you have the ancient Greek-speaking Greek in the pagan world, but you also have ancient Greek-speaking Greek in this Christianizing world. And so the people in Corinth is this church not far from Eleusis, by the way. In fact, today it's only an hour west of Eleusis, and one of the earliest churches is there, and Paul is addressing this early church in Greek. And at the bottom, you can read the English, but he's essentially yelling at them for consuming the wrong kind of Eucharist. And earlier in this chapter, he calls it a cup of demons. And at the end, he says, that's why so many of you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. And I highlighted the word koimontai there. So koimao in Greek, I can tell you for certain, does not mean to fall asleep. Koimao means to die, because it's the exact word that John's gospel uses about Lazarus. Remember the famous miracle where Lazarus dies and he's resurrected? That'd be a pretty shitty miracle if Lazarus was just taking a nap and Jesus went to wake him up from a nap. So
right.
And he uses the same verb there. What Paul is saying here is that he's concerned that so many Corinthians are drinking a wine that is causing them to die. Why would wine cause you to die in a Greek world that had no distilled liquor? There was no hard alcohol in ancient Greece. Distilled liquor doesn't enter Europe until much, much later, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD, right? At this time, there's no word for alcohol either. Alcohol is Arabic, if you listen to the word, like alchemy or algebra or alcove. All these AL words all come from the Arabic. AL is like the article in Arabic, like el in Spanish or il in Italian. So at this point, wine is not known for its alcoholic content. Wine is a potion that is routinely mixed with all kinds of stuff, toxins, spices, perfumes, and plants, herbs, and fungi. And here, we don't know what to make of it, but the Corinthians are drinking something that's causing them to die.
The word is die.
Koimao absolutely means to die, because it's the word that, in fact, you can go to the next slide, Jamie. If you look it up right there, it means, just like we would say, the sleep of death, but it means death. And elsewhere in the Gospels, it's the exact word used for what happened to Lazarus before his miraculous resurrection. It's the whole point of the miracle. He is komao. He has fallen asleep to the death of sleep.
Whoa. So the speculation is that there's some sort of a psychedelic or a fungi or something that's in the wine that's causing them to die, and they're using it recreationally, and they're trying to discourage this.
That's how I read it. And it's not just based on a random read of this one line in Corinthians. It's based on an understanding of what Greek wine actually was, how far back it goes, which is centuries and centuries before this, how it was mixed, what it was mixed with. Even in the 1st century, there's a guy called Dioscorides, a Greek pharmacologist. In fact, he's called the father of drugs. And at the same time that these Gospels and Paul's letters are being written, he writes something called the Materia Medica. It's these 5 books in Greek, and every drug prescription you've ever had in your life exists because Dioscorides wrote that manuscript. And in that manuscript, in Book 5, he lists out, in Book 5 alone, 56 different recipes for spiked wine. And in the Greek, he shows you how to spike wine with everything from salvia to hellebore to henbane, which he says is good for swollen genitals. So if you have swollen genitals, you dissolve henbane into wine. He says if you drink mandrake wine, like Allegro was talking about mandrake, it'll kill you in 1 cupful. And then he says this about black nightshade in book 474. He says if you dissolve nightshade into wine, it will produce fantasias ou aedais, which in Greek means not unpleasant visions. So just from the literature, we can tell that the Greeks absolutely knew how to spike wine with very powerful substances.
Graham, I got to tell you, your microphone is really sensitive. So anytime you do anything, any movement or breathing, it bangs around for whatever reason. Sorry, I just have to make you aware of it.
So I have to sit. Be still.
No, everything's fine. But anytime you bang, it overpowers everything. Unfortunately.
Oh dear.
Sorry.
Can I be turned down at the switchboard or something?
I don't know. I don't think that's what it is. I think
I'll
it's a
clean
type
it up
of.
in the recording. That's what I was.
Jamie will clean it up.
I'm writing them down.
It's okay.
Yeah.
He's writing down all the noises. That's how good Jamie is. I wanted to bring up sage to you because one of the things that you talked about was salvia. Salvia is sage, right? They are basically in the same species, at least. When those priests would be walking down the aisle and they would be blowing sage, they're burning sage. Was that for some sort of a psychedelic effect? Is that the reason why they were doing that?
So when it comes to incense, we actually have an answer now. I'm not sure if you know this, but earlier this year in May, there were some researchers in Israel who released one of the first archaeochemical studies of ancient incense. Have you heard about this?
No.
Oh, it's so just in May, at a place called Tel Arad in Israel, south of Jerusalem, west of the Dead Sea, there was the organic remains of some kind of incense that was burned on these 2 altars that is described by the researchers as kind of a scaled-down version of Solomon's temple. It's dated to the 8th century BC, so in the Judahite period. So we could feasibly say the beginnings of the Judeo-Christian period. Oh yeah, there it is.
Frankincense. I love that word.
So under archaeochemical analysis, and this sample had actually been excavated years ago in the 1960s and was deposited in the museum. But the thing with this science, which is amazing, is that they can resurrect this stuff no matter when it was excavated. So fortunately, it wasn't contaminated. And after analysis, they found it contained THC, CBD, and CBN. So tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabidiol, and cannabinol. And so it's the first. They say it's the first example of psychoactive drug use in the ancient Holy Land, essentially.
So when they were walking down the aisle, would they use
Holy
only?
Land, essentially.
We know that
So
was when they were but sage was used as well, right? And sage is Salvia divinorum, which is a more potent psychedelic than cannabis.
Yeah, but I think that's a New World plant, though,
Is it?
if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay.
I mean, at least the one you're thinking of.
So when you say New World, you're talking about European world?
in the Americas.
Oh, Americas,
In the
really? So sage use when they would have it in that. What is that, Graham? You would know this. What is that thing that they walk down the aisle with when they blow
A
that
sensor.
smoke? A sensor? That's really what it's called? A sensor?
CENSOR. Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Or
So,
yeah, a sensor. It's an interesting double entendre there.
yeah.
Censorship. Yeah.
So they were most certainly using cannabis or something else that they were burning, and they were getting everybody high.
And frankincense.
Yeah. And what is frankincense?
It's an aromatic spice.
So it just smells nice.
We don't think it's psychoactive, but maybe at the right dose it could be.
But the cannabis certainly was. So they would give everybody marijuana smoke. Just walk down the aisle and blow marijuana smoke on everybody.
But if I may add, whether or not the smoke is psychedelic, it is adding to the experience. It's adding to the setting. And again, anybody who's worked with psychedelics will know that the setting is at least as important as the substance itself. So they're masters of creating this mysterious and powerful and energizing setting in which the psychedelic experience can then unfold.
It's such a bummer that we know so little about what exactly was going on, but so nice that someone like you has done these deep dives into it, where at least we could pull out whatever we can. And it makes me think, like, where would we be if people like you weren't doing this? It's so rare.
This is why I'm not doing DMT, man.
Because you wouldn't be doing it. I don't know. You might be doing it with more feverish need. I mean, you might be really obsessed with it. It's just, it's it's so strange. And Graham, I always go back to your statement, which I think is just such a great quote, that we're a species with amnesia. In regard to our archaeology, our history, but also in regard to our use of psychedelics.
Yeah, well, we've just not been given the straight scoop about our past. Sometimes it's just purely the way that scholars work, that academics work, and sometimes I think in the case of Christianity, it is actually a kind of conspiracy. I think there was a deliberate effort to cover up the role of psychedelics, and you could see why priests in the developing Roman Catholic faith, who've already pulled on the jackboot of the Roman Empire, you could see why they wouldn't like their congregations using psychedelics, because when you use psychedelics, you have a direct experience of the divine, and hey, you don't need that priest anymore. The priest as an intermediary between you and the divine becomes redundant. And I think that there was a concerted effort to cover up the role of psychedelics in early Christianity and to present a different narrative, which it was purely was the bread and the wine, the blood and the body of Christ, in a symbolic sense, and not in an actual sense of a substance that connects us to the divine.
So the literature that connects the banning of these psychedelic rituals in 4th century, you were saying, how does it describe it, and what was the reaction by the people?
I mean, at the time, so you have to remember that the Greek mysteries existed for a long, long time.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly how long, but the excavators, and this began in Eleusis, for example, in 1887. They date it back to at least 1500 BC. So if it survives until the 4th century AD, you're talking almost 2,000 years, as long as Christianity itself has been around. And the mysteries themselves, and there are serious scholars who came along in the 70s to say this, could have prehistoric roots, which is how I started the investigation, by asking how this actually got to the Greeks. Because what's interesting about this Kykeon potion, for example, is that it's not wine-based. In that hymn to Demeter that came down to us, she's actually offered wine in this mythical story that takes place. She's out looking for her daughter Persephone, who's been abducted and kidnapped to the underworld. And she looks for her for 9 days and nights and can't find her. And she rests her bones exhausted at Eleusis, and they try to offer her wine, and she says no. She wants that water, barley, and mint. And again, Hoffman, Wasson, and Ruck thought it was kind of like a primitive version of beer, if you think about it. It reads like a very simple beer recipe. Now, for the Greeks, all the way through the classical period, through Plato and afterwards, for them to be drinking beer instead of wine is very, very weird. For them to have a secret mystery religion that's not written down, remember, the civilization that birthed literature and the concept of the university as we know it is also very weird. So it's like they are retaining this very prehistoric ritual and this very prehistoric beverage, which is beer. And as I trace it back further and further, you can see clues of beer being used in funerary and mortuary rituals as far back as 13,000 years. And there are some who think that beer actually precedes bread at that moment we call the agricultural revolution, where the upper Paleolithic becomes the Neolithic. And Graham writes a lot about this, and very beautifully, at Göbekli Tepe, for example. So I was able to trace back the potential brewing of religious beer all the way back to Göbekli Tepe.
And the speculation is that this religious beer had some ergot. Possibly.
It's possible. It's possible. We haven't done much testing for ergot that far back. I mean, that's why I wanted to write this book, is because the science is relatively new. Archaeochemistry, for example, is relatively new. It's some of the better findings have been coming out over the past 20 years, which is like a baby in the sciences. In fact, Pat McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, who I interviewed for the book, described archaeochemistry at the time in the late 90s when he was producing some incredible finds as like an infant, which would make it like a toddler today. And so we're just beginning to put these pieces together. So we can't say there was psychedelic beer 13,000 years ago. The question right now is was there beer at all? And there's very early indications at Göbekli Tepe itself that they were brewing beer. And at another site to the southwest in Israel, at Mount Carmel outside Haifa, there's this really interesting place called the Rakafet Cave. And it was a burial site with about 30 individuals. This is between 11,700 BC and 9,700 BC. A team from Stanford went in there, and they found these boulder mortars in which they found traces of the malting and mashing of grains, which they think was for beer. This is 13,000 years ago.
Which brings us to the Upper Paleolithic, and then we have the whole mystery of rock and cave art all around the world. So Brian is right. We haven't got the analysis that proves that a psychedelic was in that 13,000-year-old beer. But what we do have 13,000 years ago, and going back much further, 27, 40, 50,000 years ago, is art. And that art really only makes sense as psychedelic art. I mean, where else but in a visionary state do you see an entity that is part human and part animal in form, that is part a lion and part a human being? It's not something you see every day. It's not something that you see when you're out hunting game. But seeing these therianthropes, as they're called, is a very common experience in deeply altered states of consciousness. So the art itself speaks to us of artists who had powerful experiences in deeply altered states.
What is the conventional speculation about those images, the half man, half animal images?
Increasingly, it is that they document psychedelic states. There's a professor at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, David Lewis Williams, written a book called The Mind in the Cave, who's documented this in great detail, that the only possible explanation for this art, which is found all over the world, is not just found in one region or one place, is that the artists were shamans, that they were experiencing altered states of consciousness, and when they returned to a normal everyday state of consciousness, they remembered their visions and painted them on cave walls. And those visions might well be a lion man or a bison man, and that entity had communicated with them just in the way that entities communicate with us today under the influence of DMT or psilocybin.
Did you have a sense of urgency while you were writing this? Did you understand that this is something that very few people who are legitimate scholars are going to really tackle?
Well, it hadn't been done, and I don't know why nobody was doing this, and combining the humanities and the linguistics with the sciences. I've been waiting for this book to come along, and no one wrote it.
So you had to write it yourself.
Since I wasn't doing DMT, I had plenty of free time.
How long did it take?
12 years.
Was there any point in time where you were like, what the fuck am I doing?
If you ask my wife, yeah, especially. Like, you're supposed to be a lawyer, man. No one's paying you for this. You went to the Vatican?
Was there a real issue?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's you know what? It's a good point. This is really, really hard, and it brings up something. I've been talking with the researchers about this too. So when I talk about archaeochemistry, I mentioned Pat McGovern at UPenn. There's another guy, Andrew Coe at MIT. And every time I have a question, these guys are there to answer it. Andrew's awesome. He's a younger guy in his mid-40s. He's been doing this stuff his whole life. He has a background in classics, like I do, and so he's the only person I've talked to who sees like the legitimacy of this kind of pursuit, because he's one of those guys who can think about the humanities and the sciences at the same time. But it's tough. There is no discipline for this. You can't get a PhD in the hunt for ancient intoxicants. No one's out there studying for it. It just doesn't exist. And those who do study it find it very, very hard to get gainful employment. You can't get paid to do this stuff. And so a little bit later, we'll talk about two archaeochemists I've been in touch with who have remarkable findings that I want to share here. But they've each since left the discipline. So they were doing incredible work 20 years ago, in the late 90s and early 2000s, were finding incredible things. But, I mean, life being what it is, they had to leave the profession.
Well, let's get to that now. Who are they and what are they?
So there's a couple different guys. There are two finds that I really went out of my way to put into this book. One is trying to find hard evidence of this ergotized beer, and the other is trying to find actual hard evidence of wine that's been spiked. And ideally, that would be spiked wine in the context of some kind of Christian ceremony, or some syncretic Greek Christian ceremony in the 1st century AD. And so I spent years and years trying to get in contact with these folks and reading through the archaeobotany journals. And I'll start with ergot first, since I was really kind of fascinated with ergot and this hypothesis from 1978, because it sits there for now 40 years, and there's no hard data to come by. And people often argue about ergot the same way we argue about Amanita and the other candidates, because it doesn't make sense. We know it's there, we know it's common, but it doesn't make the most sense as the thing that would have spiked this beer. So I spent a long time looking for ergotized beer, or any beer that was spiked. Now, if you go to the top archaeochemists or archaeobotanists in the US, the UK, or Europe, and I did for many years, and I asked them the very simple question: is there any botanical or chemical data of beer having been spiked with psychedelics? And the universal answer that would always come back is no. And so I'd ask them again, and the answer would be no. And so I started to think about the ancient world and what that meant, and what ancient Greece meant. And so first I went to the site at Eleusis to ask the archaeologist there if we could test her vessels. And I couldn't believe that nobody had ever asked her if they could submit the vessels to chemical testing. And so I flew there and I talked to her about it, and she said, unfortunately, they've all been treated for conservation purposes. They put them in museums and they exhibit them to the public, and when you do that, you contaminate the artifact, and it's no longer testable. So that was my dead end. And that's where things stopped for a while, and that's where my wife starts asking,
Brian,
you flew to Greece by yourself and left your 2 daughters at home for no reason, so you could ask a lady if you could test her chalices, and she told you no. And now what are you going to do? And so I said, well, I'm going to get creative, man. And so I thought about the ancient Greek world. Here's the thing about the ancient Greek world. In the wake of Alexander the Great, who was called the Great for a reason, the Greek influence after the 4th, 3rd century BC stretched all the way from Iberia, Spain and Portugal, to Afghanistan in the east. I'm not sure if many folks realize that, but the Greek-speaking or the Greek-influenced part of the world was enormous. And so if you're looking for evidence of this Koukion, why would you restrict yourself to Athens and Eleusis? So I took a step back and I started thinking, where else would there be a Greek presence? And I didn't expect to find one, but I landed on Iberia eventually because I started researching ergot in different languages. That was my first clue. In English we have this one weird word for it, ergot. But actually in German there's lots of words for it, bizarrely enough. Maybe it's because of the history of brewing. But in German there's Afterkorn, Mutterkorn, Toadkorn, which means crazy corn, crazy grain, or Totenkorn, which means death corn. And so it's weird that, as you look elsewhere, it seems to be more common to the German mind. And then in Spanish I just started random Googling for what that is. It's called Cornezuelo de Centeno in Spanish. And a couple of things started popping up. And these notions of spiked beer started popping up where they weren't supposed to. I never expected to find them. So the first hit that came in was from an archaeological site kind of in the midwest of Spain called the Valladolid. And there in 2003, they found a Greek vessel called a Greek chalice called a kernos. And it's the same kind of vessel that's used in the Eleusinian Mysteries. It's like this little cup with a tiny cup on the outside. I brought a picture for you if you want to see it. Jamie, in Mas Castejar, if you scroll to the bottom and copy of P29. So this came. That's it. So this came from a site called the Necropolis of Las Ruedas. And the Necropolis of Las Ruedas is this archaeological site that was dated to about the 2nd century BC. Now, these aren't Greek people. This is a pre-Roman population called the Vacae, or the Vaxians. But for some reason, in this kernos, it tested positive for beer spiked with hyoscyamine. If you go to the next tab, Jamie, you'll see they wrote it up. It's in Spanish, but there you'll see that at the number 76 and 77, when they tested the kernos, which is a very Greek word, by the way, when they tested the kernos, it tested positive for traces of hyoscyamine. And hyoscyamine can only occur in these solanaceous plants, these nightshade plants. You're talking, it's the family of plants that includes very boring things like the tomato,
Eggplants.
or the potato or tobacco, but it has these nightshades like mandrake again, or henbane. And so it's one of those tropane alkaloids that could have been in henbane, for example. So here you're talking about a henbane beer, which is really weird. The even weirder part is that this is found in a funeral complex. Just like you find at Göbekli Tepe or the Raqeibet Cave in Israel 13,000 years ago, here, after thousands and thousands of years, you're seeing this pre-Roman population using beer spiked with henbane in a death cult. And where the researchers say that it was used to either facilitate the deceased's travel to the other world, or maybe the people who were there ushering the deceased into the other world. They actually use that phrase.
Holy shit. Go back to that image of the cup again, please. So, why does it have the cup on the outside of it again? There's the
Yeah.
large vessel,
Yeah.
and then there's a small vessel to the side of it.
We don't know. That's just what that's what a kernos is. If you scroll
Could it possibly have been portion control?
exactly, if you scroll to the top, Jamie, you'll see two other kernoi on the top right there. Yeah. And so this is the next part of the clue. So these came from a colony on the east coast of Iberia called Emporion, which was a bustling Greek colony. And these are other kernos vessels, just like you would see at Eleusis. These are the kinds of things that they think the initiates were drinking from. Now, they don't make for very good drinking vessels, but maybe they make for good mixing vessels, like for dosage control.
Yeah.
Something is going on there. That's what they thought the kernos was at Eleusis, for example, and that's what I wanted to test with the archaeologist there, who said no. And so now we're finding these vessels in Spain where they're not supposed to be. And I can say, as a classicist or a one-time wannabe classicist, that the first thing you think of when you think about the ancient Greeks is not Spain. And all of a sudden, I'm coming across this idea of spiked beer in Spain, and it's just not supposed to be there.
That's so fascinating. So this image, what is can you go back to that original image, Jamie? Of the cup with the small cup now. What is what's the conventional description of what this is and why it's shaped this way?
I mean, the Spanish archaeologists,
Yes.
they also call this a kernos. It's the extent of the Greek influence at that particular site. This is the Pintia archaeological site. The extent of the relationship and the network is a little unclear, at least to me. It's unclear how strong the Greek presence was there. But at the time, by the 2nd century BC, because the Greeks were already in these other port cities, basically, it's not inconceivable that some kind of trade was happening and these vessels would have made their way inland.
Do they have a description as to why there's a small cup connected to the larger cup, though?
It would be the same as any Greek archaeologist has too. We don't know why this was associated with the mysteries. No one knows why.
It really does logically make sense that it would be some sort of a portion because it's very small. Obviously, you don't want to have too much of that shit.
Yeah,
That's so-
it really does make complete sense, actually.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That you take one portion of this and mix it with 10 portions of that,
Yeah.
and then you're going to have an interesting journey.
Yeah, I can't think of another explanation off the top of my head. Obviously, I'm not qualified to speculate, but when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, that fits.
But you're on the right track because that's where it led me to was portion control,
Yeah.
and that's what I found next.
What'd you find next?
I found some things, man.
What'd you find, man?
So, kernos, right? I'm thinking kernos vessels, and so the vessel doesn't just show up in the middle of Spain. There, it shows up on the coast at this, and so this town's called Emporion, and today it's called Ampurias, and it's in Catalonia, in northeast Spain, close to the border with France. And to be totally honest, I'd never heard of Emporion, and I'm not sure if many classicists have, but it was a bustling import-export business of the ancient Greeks, founded by the Phocaians, who came from Ionia, which is today modern-day Turkey. And they found this place in 575 BC, and we think that the religion comes with them, or some kind of religion. Jamie, if you go back to Mas Castejar, you can see just an exterior shot of what this colonial town looks like. And when you look at it, again, there, I mean, it looks, that could be southern Greece. That could be an island in Greece. That's on the northeast coast of Spain. That's a statue of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, standing in a courtyard in Spain.
And the statue dates to...
At least 5th century BC.
Wow.
And we don't know really what's going on, but in the next slide, the Phocians who founded this place were devotees of, that's supposed to be Persephone on the left. The Greek goddess Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, the same goddess who the initiates would find when they made their pilgrimage to Eleusis and drank the potion. They went there to meet Persephone. And there she is on their coins. And then it gets more interesting.
How?
So these people don't stick to the coast. They go inland at some point, and they go inland for a reason. And there's a site that they found called Mas Castejar de Pontos. It's a tiny town called Pontos, and there's this farm that the archaeologists describe as a Greek farm, a bit further inland. Jamie, if we go back to the same file there, we can just click through a bunch of the images and the kinds of things that they found, which are indicative of the Greek mystery. So starting with her, for example, that was unearthed at this archaeological site in Pontos, and the archaeologist responsible for this dig, who's been the same woman over the past since 1990, her name is Enriqueta Fons. She found this and other objects. She calls this the head of Persephone. Or it could be the head of Demeter, but either way, she thinks it's a Greek goddess. And this is 3rd century BC.
So obviously there's some intense influence.
These are Greco-Italian amphorae, also dated to the 3rd century BC. And the next one, that's also some kind of Demeter Persephone. That's an incense burner, by the way. You stick incense in the top of it, light it up, depending on what your incense is, and it's used in cult rituals. That's 3rd century BC, and then it gets weirder. They find this, 5th century BC. That belongs in a dining room in Athens, not on a farm in Spain. That's the origin of comedy right there. That's called a komos. Komos in ancient Greek is one of these drunken parades in honor of the god Dionysus. These are the first paid regulars at the comedy school.
And he's got his dick out like Ari Shaffir. There you go. Wow. That's crazy.
So then it gets weirder. Just south of the site, they find this. And this is Triptolemus. Triptolemus is kind of the missionary of the mysteries. So after Demeter establishes her temple in Eleusis, they send this guy to go scouring the earth to carry the knowledge of the grain and farming across Europe. And if you go to the next one, Jamie, you'll see that it's very similar to the kind of Triptolemus things that show up in Greece. This is from the Eleusis Museum, on site in Eleusis. If you compare the two, you see a dude on a flying dragon cart on the left and a dude on a flying dragon cart on the right. They're both Triptolemus. The last place I ever expected to find Triptolemus was a farm in Spain. And there it is.
Wow.
So if Triptolemus tells you anything, it tells you that the mysteries went west, when they're not supposed to, by the way. Graham alluded earlier to this incident that happened in Athens in 414 BC. To celebrate the mysteries outside of Eleusis is a sacrilege, a total sacrilege. It was called the profanation of the mysteries. And one of Socrates' star disciples, this guy Alcibiades, was caught indulging in the mystery ceremony at home instead of at the temple, and he became the Ed Snowden of the ancient world. He was ostracized. They would have killed him if he didn't run from Athens. So this was serious stuff and sacred stuff. So for them to be celebrating the mysteries, think about it, kind of makes sense because no one's looking over their shoulder in Spain. If it's going to happen anywhere, maybe it'd be in the hinterlands of the empire.
So this is people that realized that they wanted to continue these rituals and it couldn't do it in Greece anymore. They had to get out.
Right, or these were folks who either couldn't afford or didn't want to go all the way to Eleusis. I mean, you're in Spain.
Right.
Imagine getting to, you can't get to Eleusis today. Imagine getting to Eleusis 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. It's really, really difficult.
And this,
If I may give a parallel, it's rather like somebody seeking an ayahuasca experience today, and perhaps they can't afford to go all the way to the Amazon rainforest, or it just seems too big a journey, so they're going to look for somewhere nearer to home where they can have that experience. And indeed, ayahuasca is available all over the world now.
yeah, and that's pretty recently, right? Like within the last couple of decades, it's available all over the world.
Spread rapidly within the last couple of decades, and I think Brian is suggesting that a similar sort of thing was happening in the ancient world with a different substance.
The guy's name is so right on the nose too. Triptolemus.
I never thought about that
How could you not
until
think
right
of
now
that?
because I don't do DMT.
But I mean,
Yeah.
people tripping. I mean, it's just ridiculous that his name is Trip.
It's interesting.
I mean, look at him. He's riding a dragon, and his name is Triptolemus.
And on the next one too, Jamie, you'll see there's another Triptolemus.
The bullet.
Hey, start recording now or what? Do I push it and hold it? Out.
I need you alive, sister. Be careful. You find moats out there, you bring them to me. You looking to be a bad guy? Moats of dark out there just waiting, sister. Go get some. Hey, you see moats out there, you bring them to Drifter. You hear? You ready to ship out? There's enemies of humanity to shoot. Moats of dark out there just waiting, sister. Go get some.
channel, a warsat just crashed in your vicinity. I could use your help recovering its data.
We can't let the Hive claim this warsat.
Rasputin is calling in the Valkyrie at your location. The Hive suppression field is up. The Hive suppression field is up. Rasputin is calling in the Valkyrie at your location. Rasputin initiated offensive subroutines. The Javelin should be there any moment. The Hive suppression field is up. Rasputin is calling in the Valkyrie at your location. The Hive are sending an ogre.
We'll take care of it. Ogre down. Warsat clear.
All in a day's work. Great job out there.
You ready to bang Knuckles? Be seeing you, sister. Daryl.
Toss in something good. You get a prize, I keep the runoff. Everybody wins.
How you living? Be seeing you, sister.